Darkness clung to the ramparts of Winterfell, thick as tar in the moonless sky. The scattered fires in the courtyard had dwindled to embers, revealing the carnage of a battle that had pushed every living soul to the brink. In the hush that followed, there were no cheers of triumph, no exultant cries. Only the crackle of dying flames and the shallow breathing of the wounded broke the silence. The wind carried a note of dread, drifting across piles of frozen corpses, wights that had fallen, and men who had fought bravely for life. Some corners of the castle wall were painted crimson with blood, both fresh and congealed. Many living still remained huddled in corners, too exhausted or wounded to stir. Few had the strength left to speak of victory, or to believe it was within reach. The great hall, once a haven of warmth and feasting, lay in partial ruin. Benches were overturned, the grand table split from a jagged strike of undead power. Chunks of stone had fallen from the ceiling, dusting the floor in a gray powder. Somewhere, the faint whimper of a warhound signaled that life still persisted in these battered halls. Every breath was an effort, each inhalation carrying the stench of corpses, human and otherwise. The infiltration of the army of the dead had forced even the most fearless warriors to cower behind flickering torches. Yet the defenders had resisted and survived, though none could be certain if the onslaught was truly finished. Daenerys Targaryen stood near the hearth, the flames reflecting in her eyes as she surveyed the devastation. Her silver-gold hair lay in disarray, matted with soot and streaks of dried blood. Despite her exhaustion, a fierce determination still shone in her gaze. She was the breaker of chains, mother of dragons, and she refused to let her will falter. The hush in the great hall was nearly suffocating, broken only by the occasional groan from a wounded soldier. Her hand clutched the hilt of a Valyrian steel sword one of her knights had pressed into her grasp when she was momentarily disarmed. Her lungs felt raw with the cold air. She held herself tall, but inside, she battled a trembling sense of unease. Jon Snow, a short distance away, was kneeling beside a limp form. It was a fallen comrade, too far gone to be saved by anything but the stranger's mercy. Jon's dark hair was plastered to his forehead, damp with sweat, soot, and a trace of melting snow. He raised his eyes to Daenerys, his gaze etched with grief and something akin to hopelessness. They had fought and fought, risking all, yet the battle had turned more frightening than any of them had foreseen. Before the final wave of the dead receded, there had been a terrifying moment when the Night King himself stood upon the parapet of Winterfell. His icy stare had pinned each defender in a spear of dread. Even now, that lingering chill haunted the memory of anyone who had met the Night King's eyes. Exhausted steps echoed through the open doorway as Grey Worm limped into the hall, his ashen face betraying the brutal strain of command. He had led the Unsullied through wave after wave of undead, losing many of his men in the process. His shield arm trembled from fatigue, and a long cut across his forearm bled through its makeshift bandage. Yet his voice, when he finally managed to speak, held no fear. It was calm, methodical, born of a lifetime shaped by discipline. He confirmed that no fresh whites roamed the immediate castle grounds, though pockets of them were suspected to still be outside the walls, moving across the Winterfell fields like ghosts in the night. Despite the momentary lull, Daenerys could not shake a foreboding sense that the Night King was not done with them. Her dragons, Rhaegal and Drogon, were still out there, though their roars had fallen silent after the pitched aerial battles that swirled above the battlements. She dreaded to think of either beast fallen, wounded, or worse. Yet, she could not abandon the living to chase after her children. She had to remain, to rally whoever was left. As she paced the hall, every step sending jolts of pain through her muscles, she remembered how close the Night King had been, how he had reached forth and nearly seized her mind with his unearthly power. She had been saved only by the timely intervention of her allies, drawing his attention away. A swirl of cold wind swept through the great hall as the main doors creaked open. Davos Seaworth, face etched with worry, signaled that the men had closed the gates behind them for the night. The snowfall outside had begun anew, thick flakes swirling in the blackness. There would be no hasty departures from Winterfell. No chases across open fields in this storm. The living were effectively besieged, pinned by the cold, the dark, and the knowledge that the dead were still lurking somewhere beyond the outer walls. Jon moved to Daenerys' side, an unspoken concern in his eyes. She gave a faint nod, letting him know she could still stand. Around them, men and women murmured about the next steps. But no one had the heart to propose any bold ventures until they had recovered at least a fragment of their strength. A sudden echoing roar cut through the gloom, reverberating in the stone corridors and rattling shattered windows. It was not Drogon, nor was it Rhaegal. It was a guttural, unnatural sound, as though the harsh wind itself had learned how to scream. Every head snapped up. Hearts skipped beats. For a moment, no one moved. Then Grey Worm set his jaw and gestured for a handful of Unsullied to follow him. Daenerys clenched her sword more tightly, her pulse drumming in her ears. It was unclear what monstrous presence had forced its way past the gates. Was it the Night King's doing? Or some twisted creature left behind by the Great Other? In a flurry of cautious but urgent motion, they followed the corridor to one of the small courtyards near the eastern tower. Snow drifted in, settling upon corpses that had already begun to stiffen with the ice. By the flicker of a single torch, Daenerys glimpsed shadows moving in ways that defied logic. A shape loomed near the perimeter wall, tall and silent as a tree, yet with eyes that glimmered an otherworldly blue. Her heart clenched. She knew that gaze. The Night King had returned. The next moment, he stepped through the swirling snow, and she saw his spiked crown of ice. Icy power radiated from him like a tangible force. Grey Worm and the Unsullied fanned out, forming a protective line around Daenerys and the others who had followed. Among them Jon, Davos, and a half-dozen Northmen. But each man's face paled at the sight of the undead monarch. The Night King stood with an unnatural grace, an air of old malevolence that seemed beyond mortal comprehension. His gaze shifted, passing over the defenders as if appraising their fear. He made no sound. No breath flickered from his lips. They all felt the stillness that came in his presence, as though all warmth, all light, was being smothered by the hush of a grave. He raised one gaunt, pale hand. There was no swirling storm of corpses rising, no wave of newly animated dead. Instead, he let his cold eyes focus on Daenerys. She felt something tug at her mind, a subtle intrusion that made her vision blur around the edges, a chill that made the marrow in her bones ache. For a second, she faltered, her grip on the sword slackening. The voice of Jon calling her name sounded distant, muffled. The torchlight dimmed, or perhaps her sight clouded. Everything seemed to narrow until only the Night King's inhuman stare filled her consciousness. But Grey Worm lunged forward, brandishing his spear in defiance. The Unsullied advanced, and though a single blow from the Night King could fell a dozen warriors, they made their stand. The clang of steel on ice echoed in the courtyard as they launched their assault. Jon rallied the Northmen, hoping to flank the Night King, to catch him off balance with Valyrian steel. Yet all attempts to wound the creature of frost seemed futile. The Night King parried their strikes with ease, gliding through the flurry of blows as though dancing on the wind. His ancient icy blade left white trails in the air with each graceful swipe. One by one, the bravest fighters were driven back, or worse, knocked off their feet. The swirling snow turned red in places as the unstoppable might of the undead warlord crashed into the living. Amid the chaos, Daenerys fought to clear her head. She blinked hard against the seductive chill that had nearly claimed her. She advanced into the melee, ignoring the screams of wounded men around her. Her arm felt leaden, but she raised the Valyrian steel sword and let out a cry that contained all of her rage, all of her heartbreak. She slashed at the Night King's flank, hoping to draw his focus and create an opening for Jon. Sparks flew as their blades collided. A shockwave of cold sent her staggering back, her breath catching. But something about her fury, perhaps the old Targaryen fire in her blood, kept her from collapsing before his lethal gaze. In a swirl of frost, the Night King switched tactics. Instead of slicing down upon her, he swiftly reached out, a pale hand gripping Daenerys' arm. She felt a bolt of pain, as if every nerve in her body was being pierced by shards of ice. She tried to scream but had no breath. Her eyes locked onto his, and in that heartbeat, she felt her own warmth draining away. It was not an ordinary chill, nor even a cold that flesh could endure. It was an assault upon her very essence, something ancient and malevolent, forcing its way through her veins. The Night King's hold on her seemed to conquer time itself, drawing her deeper into the void of his winter. Terror and desperation blared in her heart as she tried to break free, but her strength ebbed. Jon roared in fury, hacking at the Night King's arm to free Daenerys. But the ancient creature twisted aside with an uncanny speed, keeping Daenerys between himself and Jon's blade. In that moment of horrific realization, Daenerys saw a crackling swirl of blue energy coil around the Night King's hand, seeping into her flesh. She thought of her dragons. She thought of the people who had pinned their hopes on her. Missandei, Grey Worm, the entire North, the frightened citizens across the realm longing for deliverance. She thought of how she was failing them all. Then the light around her dimmed further, until only darkness remained in the center of her vision. When the Night King finally released his grip, Daenerys slumped to the snowy ground, eyes vacant, her sword slipping from numb fingers. The courtyard was in uproar as the living shouted in terror, disbelief, denial. Jon lunged forward, disregarding his own safety, and tried to pull Daenerys away. But the Night King let out that unearthly roar again, driving men to their knees with the sheer psychic weight of his presence. Icy talons of wind battered them, forcing them back. And then, in a movement both stately and monstrous, the Night King lifted Daenerys' inert form into his arms. Before anyone could stop him, he turned toward the open rampart from which he had first appeared. Jon, Grey Worm, and all their allies fought to close the distance, but a fresh swarm of whites, silent and obedient, emerged from the darkness to bar their path. Jon screamed her name. She did not stir. The last glimpse he caught of her was the pale glow of her hair, her figure limply clutched in the Night King's hold. And then both she and her captor disappeared over the wall, vanishing into the swirling storm of ice and shadow beyond Winterfell's battered defenses. Time stretched in the silence that followed. The fresh wave of whites attacked ruthlessly, cutting off any chance of pursuit. Jon, blinded by grief and desperation, tried to fight through them, but even he had to retreat or face being overwhelmed. Once the immediate threat was driven back, the defenders stumbled into the courtyard, staring at the spot where Daenerys had been taken. The realization settled like a lead weight in their chests. She was gone, in the clutches of the Night King. No one could say if she lived or died, but all feared a fate worse than death at the hands of the undead king. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic meetings, hushed curses, and tormented speculation. Some insisted they must mount a rescue immediately, storm into the frozen wasteland to track the Night King. Others argued it was suicidal madness to send out a search party in the middle of the storm, with hundreds of whites lurking, ready to ambush. Jon's face was white with anguish. He had lost too many people already. He could not endure losing Daenerys. But the realities of the situation pinned him in place. No resources were left to spare for a chase. The living needed to regroup, to ensure the wounded were tended, to fortify what remained of Winterfell. If the Night King returned at dawn, and still, the image of Daenerys dragged away haunted them, looming like a dark omen. Unbeknownst to all within Winterfell's walls, Daenerys was not dead. She drifted in a twilight realm, a place of swirling whiteness, suspended between a tumult of fleeting memories and encroaching oblivion. She dreamed of dragon's wings beating against the horizon, of a crimson sunset over Meereen, of sunlight shimmering on the waters near Dragonstone. She heard distant voices calling her name, echoes of Missandei's gentle accent, Ser Jorah's devoted whisper, even the subdued fear of Tyrion Lannister. She saw images of her lost child, Rhaego, fleeting and unformed. Fire and blood. Fire and blood. It was the Targaryen refrain that once burned so brightly within her. Now, like a candle flickering against a consuming darkness, she felt that ember threatened by a creeping frost. Gradually, the swirl of cold grew more tangible. She sensed herself being carried across a landscape of ice and rock. The sky overhead was black, the wind biting. She tried to force her eyes open, but they felt sealed by winter's kiss. When she managed a ragged breath, she tasted bitter air that seared her throat. Some piece of her spirit fought desperately to rekindle warmth within, to summon the fiery Targaryen blood that had once made her impervious to heat. But that fire was smothered, struggling to survive against an alien presence invading every fiber of her being. Hours, maybe days, passed in this half-conscious torment. She caught glimpses of a tall fortress of ice, crystalline walls reflecting moonlight in an otherworldly glow. Haunting shapes moved across parapets that seemed grown from winter itself. Sometimes, she heard the hollow clack of bones on frozen stone. At other times, the hush was so absolute it felt as though the world had died. Then came the moment she truly regained awareness, a moment she would later recall in fleeting nightmares. She was laid upon a slab of freezing stone, pale figures circling around her, their inhuman faces carved from frost. The Night King stood at the center of them, silent, his gaze the eye of a storm. Cold hands restrained her arms and legs. Daenerys tried to struggle, but her limbs felt sluggish, her muscles locked by an icy ache. The presence of the undead pressed in, suffocating her with the stench of death and the unnatural chill that radiated from their bodies. She expected them to kill her, to plunge a sword of ice into her chest. But nothing so merciful awaited her. Instead, she watched as the Night King drew closer. There was a timeless, ritualistic atmosphere in the hush, as though something deeply ancient was about to unfold. His eyes bored into her, and she sensed a dark will reaching inside her mind, searching for her life spark. She tried to muster defiance, to spit in his face or utter a curse, but the cold was absolute, strangling her words. Then came the faint glow from the Night King's hand, a blue luminescence that spiderwebbed across her chest, creeping into the flesh beneath her skin. Daenerys felt her heart thunder once in terror, then slow, as though the blood in her veins had begun to freeze. Her breath grew shallower, her lungs no longer responding with the same ease. She felt an agony that was as much spiritual as physical, a feeling of violation deeper than any wound. It was as if the very essence of winter was taking root in her body, claiming it from within. Fire and blood warred with ice and death, her Targaryen heritage clashing against the necromancy of the Great Other. She let out a strangled cry, the closest thing to a scream she could manage. The ring of undead watchers remained motionless, their blank eyes reflecting the faint glow that pulsed from their king's hand. Time fragmented. She drifted between states of searing cold and near unconsciousness. At times she thought she saw the faces of those she loved, each face wreathed in flames that offered no heat, no salvation. Over and over, she felt a twisted power surge through her body, forging new connections to an old, primal force. Bit by bit, her human heartbeat faltered. Her tears froze on her lashes. Her mind teetered, threatened to dissolve, but an ancient defiance lingered in her bones, refusing to vanish entirely. She had always considered herself the unburnt, mistress of dragons, goddess of flame reborn. Yet now, the bite of winter was more unrelenting than any fire. Her body was changing in ways she could not comprehend. When the last spark of the ritual's energy receded, she remained alive, or something close to alive. But no longer the same Daenerys Targaryen who had once strode across battlefields with Drogon's shadow behind her. She opened her eyes, felt the pain recede into a numbness that went beyond mortal comprehension. She sensed the presence of the Night King still looming, but it no longer seemed an external horror. Instead, it was akin to an echo inside her own mind, urging her to stand, to obey. Something in her recognized the trap. She was bound, not by chains, but by the icy tendrils coiled around her spirit. Outside the fortress, the wind howled as a new day dawned, casting a gray light that scarcely penetrated the swirling snow. Daenerys rose from the slab, her movements unsteady, but guided by an unseen pull. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaped as before, slender and delicate, yet the flesh was pale to the edge of translucence. She felt no warmth in them. If her heart beat at all, it was faint, muffled, distant. The watchers around her parted, allowing her to step forward on bare feet, that left no imprint in the snow drifting across the floor. She realized the old vulnerabilities of mortal life had given way to a new, dreadful power. The cold no longer bothered her. Its presence was a comfort, a monstrous lullaby that beckoned her deeper into an existence of endless winter. A single white advanced, bowing its head in subservience. Daenerys gazed into its lifeless eyes and felt a terrible kinship. This, then, was her new realm, an empire of ice under the dominion of the Night King. But somewhere in the recesses of her being, Daenerys Targaryen yet breathed. She felt it as a tiny ember in a world of frost, threatened with extinction, but not yet snuffed out. She closed her eyes, tried to remember the heat of Drogon's breath, the roar of flames across a battlefield. It came to her as a phantom warmth, flickering and weak. And in that moment, she discovered that her new condition was not a simple, mindless servitude. She still possessed her consciousness, though it was entangled in the Night King's will like a moth trapped in frozen sap. Her body, however, answered to new instincts. She turned from the watchers and made her way through the corridors of ice. She did not shiver. Her footfalls were silent upon floors slick with frost. The fortress felt ancient, grown from glacial walls, shaped by centuries of unnatural craftsmanship. But the hush enveloped every corner, broken only by the faint scrape of whites patrolling or the distant rumble of shifting ice. Daenerys explored without conscious direction, guided by a subtle, persistent summons. It led her to a wide balcony overlooking a bleak expanse of tundra. Below, countless whites were assembled, a silent legion stretching toward the horizon. No banners flew in the wind, for this was an army of the dead, beyond mortal pageantry. She gazed upon them, and for a brief moment, something akin to sorrow welled in her. Then a flicker of the Night King's presence quelled that emotion, drowning it in cold resolve. At Winterfell, those who survived the next night were consumed by dread. Jon and his allies had been forced into a precarious stand, anticipating another assault they were not sure they could repel. Rhaegal and Drogon had emerged at dawn, circling the skies in a frantic search for their mother. Their roars shook the fortress, fraying the nerves of every warrior who looked up at the leaden sky. The dragons would not rest. Without Daenerys' calming influence, both beasts were restless and prone to rage, spitting fire into the open fields as though trying to melt the very horizon to find her. Jon worried that they would scorch their own allies, but somehow the dragons understood that those behind the walls of Winterfell were not their enemies. Even so, their flight patterns betrayed desperation. They had lost the connection to their mother, and it filled them with deep distress. Jon held council with Tyrion, Sansa, Arya, and the few surviving lords of the north. Their voices were hushed, haunted by the knowledge that Daenerys was likely beyond their reach. They didn't know if she was dead, imprisoned, or worse. Tyrion's eyes were bloodshot, his exhaustion evident in the trembling of his hands. He whispered a chilling theory: that the Night King might seek to corrupt Daenerys, turning her into a weapon against the living. Grey Worm refused to believe it at first, but the evidence of the Night King's powers and the abrupt severance of Daenerys' bond with her dragons made such an outcome horrifyingly plausible. Days slipped by in a haze of frantic repairs, scouting missions that seldom returned, and the grim acceptance that the war was still far from over. Scarcely any joy was found in the meager victories they had scored. Food supplies ran low. Cold crept into every room, every corridor, gnawing on morale like a starving wolf. Jon found his thoughts drifting incessantly to Daenerys, remembering her fierce smile, her unwavering sense of purpose. He recalled how hope radiated from her in every stance, how she had once survived fire and emerged triumphant with dragons at her command. He could not reconcile that image with the notion of her being subjugated by the forces of death. One bitter dawn, as the watchers on the walls scanned the horizon with anxious eyes, they saw something moving in the distance. Dark shapes, accompanied by a rolling bank of storm clouds. The watchers shouted in alarm, and the fortress of Winterfell braced for the worst. Horns sounded, echoing across the courtyard. Men rushed to man the ramparts, though their faces were pale. The sound of war drums pounded in their hearts, if not in the air. Grey Worm led the Unsullied onto the walls, stoic in the face of impending doom. Jon stood near the front gate, Longclaw at his side, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. Was Daenerys among the approaching army of the dead, or was she lost to them forever? The wind whipped across the open fields, carrying biting cold that stung cheeks and froze eyelashes. Shadows lengthened as the shape drew nearer, revealing a swarm of white walkers astride undead horses, and at their head, a single tall figure clad in black ice. The Night King. Beside him, another figure rode a pale horse. At first glance, it seemed that the rider was one of his lieutenants, robed in swirling darkness. But when the watchers peered through the swirling snow, they beheld a shock that knifed their hearts. It was Daenerys Targaryen, her eyes an otherworldly blue, her once vibrant face gone pale, drained of mortal warmth. A crown of frozen crystals adorned her silver hair, which moved in the wind like tendrils of moonlight. She gazed upon Winterfell with an inscrutable expression. A murmur of horror rippled among the defenders. Tyrion stood on tiptoe to see over the parapet and let out a shaky breath. His voice trembled. "Oh gods," he whispered, though none could hear him over the rush of wind. Jon leaned forward, gripping the stone crenellation so hard his knuckles whitened. He would not, believe what his eyes told him. Yet there she was, cloaked in a presence that stifled the warmth around her. Daenerys, or some undead facsimile, was now at the Night King's side. The hush that followed was an agony, as if even the wind had paused to witness the unspeakable tragedy. Daenerys urged her horse closer to the outer gates, ignoring the ranks of the undead that trailed behind her. She radiated a calm that was dreadful to behold. When she halted, her voice, once so passionate, emerged in a low, resonant tone that seemed to echo with the frost in her lungs. She called out for Jon, her words carrying eerily over the distance. Those on the walls stood transfixed, uncertain whether to meet this invitation or flee from it. Jon swallowed hard. 1,000 conflicting emotions raged in his chest: love, horror, denial, an urge to rescue her, a knowledge that the woman he loved might already be beyond saving. Finally, he signaled for the gate to remain closed, but he moved to stand upon the ramparts directly above the entry, staring down at the dreadful spectacle below. Through the swirl of snow, Daenerys lifted her gaze to meet his. The once vibrant violet color of her eyes was replaced by a glacial blue, but something within them flickered, a spark of recognition, or so Jon dared to imagine. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Daenerys was the first to break the silence. She told Jon they had fought for the realm of the living, but the living had always betrayed one another, always failed to see the true path. Her voice was hauntingly calm, without anger or malice, simply an eerie acceptance. She spoke of a new era, a quiet that would sweep across the realm, a final peace unbothered by the petty squabbles of lords and kings. Winter eternal, she called it, the only destiny that could unite the land. Tears pricked Jon's eyes, but they froze before they could fall. He called her name, tried to reach the part of her that was still alive, still Daenerys Targaryen. A faint flicker crossed her face, as though a distant memory had stirred. But the Night King's presence loomed behind her, a silent sentinel that left no room for hope. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, a tremor ran through her frame. Then she lifted her hand, and the Legion of the Dead shifted in anticipation. The watchers on the walls gripped their weapons, hearts pounding. The next moment, Daenerys let out a breath that crystallized in the air, and a swirling gale of ice hammered the gates. It was a power akin to dragonfire, but of the cold, forming spiked shards of frost that tore at the massive wooden beams. Splinters flew as the gates groaned under the assault. Jon shouted for the defenders to brace themselves, to fight for their lives. Though his voice rang with conviction, deep inside, he was shattering. He could not imagine striking down the woman he loved. And yet, if she was truly lost, if she threatened the entire realm, what choice did he have? The Whites surged forward with their silent obedience, weapons of rusted steel and bone brandished. The White Walkers advanced with eerie grace, each a pale reflection of the deathly power that ruled them. Daenerys hovered behind them, frost swirling around her in a vortex. Her hair and garments, snapping in the wind. The gates began to crack. On the walls, arrows rained down, though it was unclear if any would find their mark against the dead. In that heart-stopping moment, the dragons overhead bellowed a thunderous roar. Rhaegal and Drogon dove from the stormy sky, unleashing torrents of flame upon the undead ranks. Fire and ice collided in an apocalyptic clash, steam exploding where the two forces met. The battlefield lit up with an orange glow, and for a fleeting instant, the defenders felt a surge of hope. But then they saw Daenerys lift her hand, and a swirl of frost enveloped the nearest dragon flame, smothering it with unnatural speed. The dragons wheeled away, shrieking in confusion, as if they sensed their mother's presence, yet could not reconcile it with the wave of cold that repelled their fire. Jon swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain steady. He could see the anguish in the dragon's movements, and it mirrored the turmoil in his own heart. Again, he shouted Daenerys' name, his voice raw. This time, she turned her face up to him, an unholy glint in her azure eyes. A faint, bittersweet curve touched her lips, reminiscent of the warm smile she once gave him under a southern sun. But it was laced with sorrow, and the inevitability of a tide that cannot be turned back. Deep inside, the part of Daenerys that remained aware wept silently, fighting against the Night King's hold, desperate to resist. Yet the storm within her had grown too strong. She could not deny the tide of winter that coursed through her veins. A shrill horn sounded from the undead ranks, an echo that sent ravens bursting into the sky from the distant forests. The dead began their charge toward Winterfell's walls in earnest, smashing against the gates with ruthless intent. The defenders loosed arrows, dropped stones, spears, any weapon they could muster to keep the horde at bay. Above, the heavens seethed with black clouds, pregnant with more snow. Lightning flickered, revealing the contorted faces of the whites as they clamored for the blood of the living. And in the midst of the chaos, Daenerys stood with a regal stillness, a queen of ice, commanding an army that would not tire, would not falter. Jon refused to abandon his post. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed tight ranks along the battlements, their discipline unbroken even in the face of certain doom. Arya crouched in a shadowy alcove, scanning the dead for a chance to strike with her Valyrian steel dagger. Sansa and Tyrion oversaw the defense inside, rallying the wounded, bolstering the final lines of resistance. Yet all of them, every man, woman, and child, knew they were caught in the gravest crisis of their lives. How do you fight an enemy that wields your beloved as its champion? And so began the siege of Winterfell, under the shadow of Daenerys Targaryen turned White Walker. The storms grew fiercer. The nights lengthened. Daylight brought no relief. The dragons roared in the skies, uncertain whether to fight or flee. Jon's heart bled each time he saw Daenerys, her complexion like moonlit snow, her eyes an unyielding glacier. From the ramparts, they locked gazes again and again, torn by a longing that was at once tragic and terrifying. She seemed on the brink of remembering. But the forces binding her to the Night King were ancient, relentless. Within the fortress, behind half-crumbled walls and barricaded doors, the living whispered legends. Could a White Walker be turned back to the living? Some spoke of love's power, but their words carried little conviction in the winter air. Others wondered if dragonfire might cleanse her, but that notion sent shudders of horror through anyone who cared for Daenerys. Time and again, Jon debated if the dagger of Valyrian steel was the only mercy they could offer her. Yet his hand recoiled at the thought. Every path led to despair, and still, the next assault came, wave upon wave, each more brutal than the last. In the secrecy of candlelit chambers, Tyrion pored over old manuscripts, scouring them for any clue about reversing the magic of the White Walkers. He found vague references, half-rumors and cryptic lines penned by maesters long dead. The Children of the Forest, legend said, had once performed miracles with weirwood magic, but that was all lost to time, and the heart trees offered no guidance. One line, however, captured Tyrion's attention, scribbled in the margins of a crumbling tome: when fire meets ice in the forging of souls, the chain may yet break. Vague as it was, Tyrion clung to it, hoping it might hold some key to saving Daenerys. He resolved to speak with Jon, to see if any plan could be formed around such a cryptic notion. But every passing hour brought more violence at the gates, and the very prospect of parley with the undead host seemed impossible. Still, the living clung to life, battered and nearly broken, but not yet surrendered. And Daenerys, caught in the churning seas of the Night King's power, stood beneath the swirling storm, teetering on the brink of eternal night. Somewhere deep within her, that small ember of Targaryen fire refused to die. She could feel it, hidden behind layers of encroaching ice. With every clash of steel and every roar of dragons, it sparked again, offering a glimmer of warmth. In these moments, she sensed a flicker of her old self, a ghostly reflection that yearned to be free. But the more she fought, the tighter Winter's grip became. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that would rend the world in two. The living united in final desperation, and the dead led by a queen torn between her destiny and her doom. Jon slept little in those days. Each time he dared close his eyes, he was assaulted by half-formed nightmares. Daenerys' face looming in the darkness, fading from the woman he knew into the cold, unreadable mask of a White Walker. Other times he dreamt of dragonfire pouring from her lips, scorching Winterfell's battlements, while she laughed in a voice filled with ice. He would jolt awake in a cold sweat, though no sweat could truly form in the relentless chill that had descended upon them. The fortress felt like a mausoleum, the corridors echoing with hush and dread. He took to pacing in the pre-dawn hours, wrapped in a heavy cloak, passing by the lines of exhausted defenders. Sometimes he paused at the gates to peer through the small cracks in the timber, looking for any sign that the undead had fallen back. But they never fell back for long. In one of these half-lit hours, he stood outside the cramped chamber where Tyrion pored over musty old tomes. The door was partly ajar, and he could see the Lannisters seated at a small desk, a single candle illuminating his tired features. Blankets draped Tyrion's shoulders, though they didn't stop his shivers. Parchment lay scattered in front of him, covered in notes scrawled by an unsteady hand. Every so often, Tyrion rubbed his eyes, fighting the lure of sleep. He looked as though he'd aged a decade. Jon had never felt more sympathy for his one-time hand. Tyrion was grappling with a problem so enormous, so impossible, that it weighed on him like an anvil. Tyrion noticed Jon in the doorway and lifted a hand in greeting. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Lord Snow," he said, forcing a pale semblance of a smile. "Or do I call you king in the north these days?" Jon stepped into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. The single candle threw their shadows against the uneven stone walls, creating the impression of giant specters looming above. Jon felt suddenly claustrophobic in the cramped space. "You can call me whatever you like," he muttered. "I'm no king if I can't protect my people." His gaze drifted to the manuscripts. "Have you found anything at all?" Tyrion sighed, thumbing through a few brittle pages. Legends, half-truths, tall tales that might predate the long night. The same ramblings I told you about before. But I keep coming back to this cryptic line. He pointed to a piece of parchment upon which he had carefully copied the words. "When fire meets ice in the forging of souls, the chain may yet break." It suggests that if a mortal is corrupted by the power of the White Walkers, there might be a way, some catalytic meeting of opposites, that can undo it. But there are no details. No mention of how one might conjure such a phenomenon. Jon leaned over the desk, his brow furrowed. "Does it say if it has to be a specific magic, or a place, or nothing?" "It's all riddles," Tyrion admitted. "But sometimes riddles contain a measure of truth. And I fear it may be the only hope we have. Otherwise," he trailed off, passing a hand over his face, "we can't just kill her. We have to try something, anything. You know that." "Nemdwasha." Jon nodded. His voice caught when he spoke. "Yes, I know." The notion of driving Valyrian steel into Daenerys' heart made him physically ill. He could face the most terrifying horrors of the dead, but not the prospect of taking her life, even to save the realm. In the flickering candlelight, he looked older than his years, the lines of grief etched deep in his face. Before he could voice another question, there was a sudden commotion in the hallway. Urgent footfalls, clanking armor, the raised voice of an unsullied soldier. Jon and Tyrion exchanged glances. As one, they hurried from the room, hearts pounding. The corridor beyond was narrow and dimly lit by sporadic torches. Grey Worm appeared at the far end, a small bandage crossing his brow, a determined set to his jaw. "What is it?" Jon demanded, striding to meet him. Tyrion was at his side, trying not to trip over the scattered stones that littered the floor from the earlier assaults. Grey Worm inclined his head. A group of whites tried to breach the south tower. They didn't succeed, but we've taken casualties. We need more men on that wall, or they'll break through next time. Nonter. Jon hissed a breath, resisting the urge to punch the stone. Winterfell was badly undermanned. They had to guard the main gate and multiple vulnerable spots along the perimeter. The never-ending barrage of undead felt like a slow suffocation. "Where's Davos?" he asked, forcing his mind back to the practicalities of command. Grey Worm gestured toward the stairs. "He's organizing the archers on the northern ramparts. I sent a runner for him." Jon ran a hand over his beard, which had grown ragged in the recent weeks. He glanced at Tyrion. "Stay with him? See if you can direct our limited resources. I'll head to the south tower." His gray eyes flickered to Grey Worm. "Lead me there." They navigated the corridors, picking a path that avoided the worst rubble. The footfalls of their boots echoed with an eerie hollowness. At intervals, they passed scuffed forms. Soldiers too wounded or too exhausted to stand, leaning against the walls. Many didn't even look up at Jon's approach. Their eyes were distant, haunted by the knowledge that no reinforcement was on its way, and no respite seemed likely. More than one whispered a greeting to Grey Worm, their voices trembling with relief that their commander still lived. When they emerged onto the battlements near the south tower, the frigid wind ripped at their cloaks, and snow pelted them in near horizontal gusts. The cold sky was bright with midday light, though it offered no warmth. Below, the battlefield stretched like a frozen wasteland. Corpses from previous engagements dotted the field. Some men, some whites, all half buried in drifts of snow. A fresh wave of the dead was visible in the distance, no more than silhouettes in the whiteness, prowling in slow circles. The Night King's presence was not seen that morning, nor was Daenerys. Jon tried to tell himself that was a good sign, that if Daenerys were truly lost, she would be leading every assault. But the truth was more complicated. She often appeared for moments in the midst of an attack, standing at a distance with a statue-like calm, issuing silent orders that the whites obeyed. Then she would vanish into the swirling snow, as intangible as a phantom. Each time Jon caught sight of her, his heart seized with hope and fear in equal measure. Jon discovered that 2 of the watchmen had fallen from the tower during the night, either dragged or pushed by whites. Their bodies hadn't been recovered, presumably devoured or reanimated by the undead horde. A pang of guilt twisted Jon's stomach. He knew their names, young Northmen who had pledged to stand by him. He clenched his jaw, promising himself he would remember their sacrifice. No time to mourn them now. Winterfell's defense hinged on every able body holding every vantage point. He swung his gaze across the parapet, scanning for weaknesses. The south tower's walls bore deep gouges from some monstrous assault, perhaps an undead giant or a cluster of whites that had banded together, scaling the stones with unnatural strength. Jon ordered the men to fortify the spot with sharpened stakes and oil pots for burning. A handful of the free folk, led by a scarred young woman who had once traveled with Tormund, arrived to help. Their presence reminded Jon that Tormund had left weeks ago to gather survivors in the far north, but no word had come from him since. Still, the woman insisted that Tormund was alive. Her eyes carried a fierce glint that would not countenance the idea of his death. She oversaw her people with a natural authority, giving Jon a curt nod that said, "Enough. We will fight. We will not falter." The hours bled into each other, marked by small skirmishes. Occasionally, a knot of whites would lurch forward through the snow, attempting to probe the defenses. Arrows found their undead hearts. Elsewhere, the dragons soared overhead. Rhaegal circled close to the walls, roaring as though calling for Daenerys, while Drogon patrolled at a higher altitude, unleashing fire at any large mass of undead he spotted. The flames brought some measure of security, but the whites were too many, too tireless, and they always returned with the next wave of blowing snow. By nightfall, Jon found himself on the verge of collapse. He had not eaten all day, and his limbs were shaking from more than just the cold. Grey Worm insisted he sit by a small hearth the soldiers had built in a sheltered alcove. The dull glow of firelight provided a meager warmth, and Jon's eyes felt heavy. He forced himself to sip from a tin cup of weak ale. The taste stale on his tongue, but at least it soothed his parched throat. Grey Worm stood nearby, impassive and watchful, ensuring no threat would catch them unawares. "We can't last like this forever," Jon murmured, letting his head drop against the rough stone. His breath condensed in the air. "We're whittling ourselves down day by day. The dead never tire." Grey Worm nodded. "We must find a way to break their leader." He hesitated, glancing away. "Or Queen Daenerys." Jon flinched at the mention of her name. He stared into the fire, watching the embers swirl. Whenever he let himself remember, a physical ache radiated in his chest. "Yes," he whispered. "We must." They stayed like that for a moment, the hush broken only by the crackle of the small fire. The fortress was mostly quiet now, save for the watchmen calling to each other on the ramparts. Night pressed in, the wind moaning around the crumbling towers. The ghosts of the recently fallen seemed to linger in the gloom. After a time, Tyrion appeared, footsteps soft. He looked no less haggard than before, but there was a taut sense of resolve in the lines of his face. He glanced from Jon to Grey Worm, then settled himself on a wooden stool near the hearth. Pulling his blankets closer, he sighed. That cryptic line, "I can't get it out of my head. Fire meets ice in the forging of souls." It must refer to some clash of the two primal powers that shaped this entire struggle. Dragonfire and the White Walker's ice magic. Jon's attention sharpened. He set his cup down, the last dregs of ale sloshing. "Go on." "I'm not a maester," Tyrion said carefully, "and there are no living experts on the creation of White Walkers, unless you count the Night King himself. But we do know that Valyrian steel can harm them, and dragonfire can destroy whites. Fire has a role to play in opposing their power. But Daenerys isn't some random white. She's turned, yet she's also. She was Mother of Dragons. Her Targaryen blood is infused with magic of its own, of a sort. Perhaps that's why the Night King wanted her. Perhaps by uniting her innate fire with his ice, he's forged something new." Grey Worm's face was unreadable in the flickering light. Jon quietly listened, his heart racing. A memory surfaced. Sam once mentioning how the creation of the first White Walkers was a merging of the children's magic with something else. Dragonglass, the blood of men. A forging indeed. But that knowledge offered no immediate solution. Tyrion continued, "We need an event. A confrontation that forces the fire within her to clash with the ice. If that cryptic line is correct, the chain on her soul might break. She may be freed from his hold." Now, Winnie. Jon remembered the old stories of Daenerys walking through flames unharmed, hatching dragons from stone eggs. That was magic beyond mortal ken. "But how?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "She resists dragonfire now, or she snuffs it out. She stands side by side with the Night King. Is there any flame strong enough to overcome that? If her own dragons can't burn her free?" "It may require something else," Tyrion said slowly. "A direct merging of her old magic with the new ice. A literal forging. But that's speculation. We don't know what that looks like." He paused, eyes glinting with a grim idea. "Could we expose her to dragonfire at the same moment that she's struck by Valyrian steel? Or at the very least, hold her in place while the flames do their work?" Grey Worm grimaced. "That would kill her." "Not necessarily," Jon said, but his voice shook. A memory flickered of her stepping unharmed from Khal Drogo's pyre. That was Daenerys' unique gift, being the unburnt. But if the White Walker magic has changed her too much, it might destroy her along with the ice. I can't risk that unless we have no other way. Knitting. The flicker of hope in Tyrion's expression dimmed, replaced by sorrow. Grey Worm's lips tightened. "We may not have a choice," he murmured. "She wages war on us every day." Jon released a ragged breath and stood. His muscles ached from disuse, and pins and needles rippled through his legs. He glanced at the fire, fighting the urge to kick it out in frustration. "We'll search for a less perilous plan," he said, though he heard the uncertainty in his own voice. "Keep looking, Tyrion. Tomorrow we meet again to discuss the next steps. For now, we need to prepare for whatever assault comes tonight." "No." They parted with solemn nods, each weighed down by the knowledge that time was slipping away. Outside the wind howled, and the swirling snow muffled any sound of distant undead. But the watchers on the walls knew the horde was out there, milling and shifting in the darkness, waiting for the next command from their icy queen and her unholy king. That night, no large-scale attack materialized. The defenders had grown so used to nightly battle that the silence felt like a trap. Jon stood watch atop the great keep, scanning the gloom for a flicker of movement. The winter sky was moonless, a solid black dome. The only light came from the torches flickering along the walls, small islands of orange in a sea of cold. Sleep tugged at his eyelids, and more than once he nearly drifted off where he stood. But each time he stirred, gazing fiercely into the distance, expecting to see an army of whites marching on them like a tidal wave. The quiet was worse than a siege, filling his mind with dreadful possibilities. He left the walls in the hour before dawn, heading to a small storeroom near the courtyard where the wounded were being tended. He wanted to check on those who had survived the latest skirmishes. The air inside was sour with the smell of blood, unwashed bodies, and the tang of stale poultices. Lanterns hung from makeshift hooks, casting a weak circle of yellowish light. On rows of cots, men and women groaned in various states of injury. A few were so pale that Jon suspected they wouldn't last another day. But the presence of living breath, no matter how labored, offered a grim reassurance. Winterfell's people still clung to life. He recognized some of them. A fisherman's son from White Harbor, missing an arm. An older knight from the Vale, delirious with fever. A young unsullied soldier who had lost an eye. Jon moved among them, offering words of encouragement or a gentle squeeze of the shoulder. He felt inadequate. He had no illusions that his presence was a balm, but it was all he could give. Finally, he found Gilly, who was assisting the healers by preparing bandages from torn sheets. Her cheeks were gaunt, and her hair was disheveled. Yet she worked tirelessly, expression determined. Jon approached quietly. Gilly turned, a faint smile forming. "You should be resting," she said, voice soft but firm. "We need you in fighting shape." "I can't sleep when so many are suffering," Jon replied. His gaze swept the cramped space. "Do they have enough supplies?" Gilly frowned. "Barely. The maesters had some leftover remedies, but it's nothing compared to the number of wounded. And every day more come in. We can't send them anywhere else. We can't even bury the dead properly in this cold." She lowered her voice, glancing at a cot where a man was groaning in his fever. "If this goes on much longer, we'll run out of everything. Food, medicine, hope." Jon's throat tightened. He whispered, "We're doing all we can." But the words felt hollow, an empty comfort. He gripped Gilly's arm gently. "Thank you for helping." He broke off, unsure how to finish the thought, then gave a subtle shake of his head. "Keep doing what you can." She nodded, eyes glistening, and returned to her work. Jon turned away, feeling the weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders like a boulder. Outside, the night was beginning to pale, dawn creeping in with a muted gray glow that did nothing to dispel the chill. Snow continued to fall in lazy drifts, piling against walls and swirling in corners of the courtyard. A horn blast shattered the morning stillness. Jon froze, heart leaping into his throat. He recognized the signal. The watchers had spotted something, someone, approaching. Fear prickled down his spine. How many more times would they endure an assault at dawn? He sprinted for the main gate, ignoring the protests of his tired legs. By the time he climbed the ladder to the walkway above the gate, his lungs burned. One of the archers pointed into the distance. There, beyond bow range, stood a single rider, haloed by the swirling snow. A torch sputtered in the rider's hand. No mass of whites surrounded them, just a lone figure. Jon narrowed his eyes. "Who is it?" he barked at the archer. "Can't tell, my lord," the man replied anxiously. "But it looks. I think it's a wildling. The clothing, the stance, could be one of Tormund's group." And now, Jon's pulse quickened. Could Tormund have finally returned? Or was it some trick of the dead? He ordered the gates to remain closed, but signaled for the rider to come closer, if they meant no harm. The figure obliged, urging their horse forward at a careful pace. As they came within hailing distance, the watchers aimed arrows, ready to loose at the slightest sign of threat. Jon felt sweat bead on his brow despite the cold. The rider halted a stone's throw from the gate, lifting the torch higher. Then they spoke, voice rough. "I come alone. Let me in. By the old gods, I'm half frozen." It was Tormund Giantsbane's voice, though weaker than Jon remembered. Relief flooded Jon's chest like a warm tide. He shouted for the men to open the gates, but to stay on guard. With a groan and a yank of chains, the battered doors parted just enough for Tormund to slip through on his horse. Then they were slammed shut again, and the crossbeams lowered, sealing out the deadly winter once more. Jon hurried down into the courtyard, reaching Tormund's side as the wildling dismounted. Tormund almost stumbled, and Jon caught him. The big man was shockingly thin, his red hair and beard dusted with ice. His breath came in ragged bursts, white plumes in the air. His usual boisterous grin was nowhere to be found. "Tormund," Jon said urgently, ushering him away from the swirling snow. "What happened? Where are the others?" Tormund's eyes were bloodshot, face drawn with fatigue. "Gone," he managed in a hoarse whisper. "Most of them. We tried to rally survivors, gather them south. But the whites, they hunt in packs. We lost whole villages, burned what we could, fled here." He coughed, spitting out phlegm flecked with blood. Jon helped him limp toward a brazier, mindful that Tormund's horse was too exhausted to remain standing much longer. A stable hand rushed forward to assist. "How many are left?" Jon asked quietly, bracing for the worst. 20. Maybe 30. Scattered across the region. Tormund rasped. "We tried to guide them here, but I got separated in the last storm. Don't know how many will make it." His gaze flicked around the courtyard, taking in the battered fortifications, the exhausted faces. "Looks like you're not faring much better." Jon nodded grimly. "We've been under siege for days, maybe weeks. I've lost count. The Night King is out there, and Daenerys is with him." Turned. The word clawed at his throat. "We're barely holding on, Tormund." A shadow of sorrow crossed Tormund's features. "I'm sorry," he said, voice subdued. "I liked that woman. She had spirit." Shaking himself, he attempted a half smile. "Well, at least I've arrived in time for the big fight, eh? Can't be letting you Southerners do all the dying without me?" Jon squeezed Tormund's shoulder, grateful despite the grimness of their predicament. He gestured for a couple of men to help Tormund inside, to warm him properly, and see if a hot meal was still possible. Tormund didn't protest, though he mumbled that he could walk on his own just fine. His shivering frame belied the words. No sooner had Tormund disappeared into the inner keep than a scout came dashing from the opposite side of the courtyard, face ashen. "The undead are gathering," the scout cried, breath hitching. "We saw them from the eastern wall, thousands more than before. And someone else." "She's there, my lord, the queen." The mere mention of her rank stabbed Jon like a knife. He forced himself to remain steady. "Rouse the men. Grey Worm, gather the unsullied. Sound the horns." His voice rang out across the courtyard, stirring soldiers to reluctant motion. They were all bone-tired, but necessity drove them on. "We'll man the walls, keep them from breaching." He paused, then added quietly, "No one is to harm Daenerys if they can avoid it. But if it comes to a choice between your life and hers, choose yours." The order tasted bitter on his tongue, but he could not ask his people to sacrifice themselves for a single lost soul. No matter how much that soul meant to him, he had a responsibility to keep the living alive. The horn sounded, echoing in the dawn air. And within minutes, the courtyard bustled with frantic preparation. Weapons were distributed, shields and spears raised. Archers took positions on the battlements, while the rest rushed to the gates, forming a makeshift front line behind the ramparts. The dragons roared somewhere above, as though sensing the impending clash. Jon ascended a set of stairs to the upper wall, scanning the white horizon. At first he saw nothing but drifting snow. Then, shapes emerged, countless shadows shifting in the swirling flakes. A hush fell over Winterfell's defenders, each one gripping their weapons a little tighter. From his vantage, Jon spied a tall figure at the head of the host, wearing a crown of jagged ice. The Night King stood motionless, an omen of doom. And at his side, Daenerys, her white hair whipped in the wind, her pale skin nearly blending with the snow, making the glacial blue of her eyes all the more striking. Even at a distance, Jon thought he saw sorrow in her expression, but perhaps that was only his desperate imagination. A sense of foreboding clenched Jon's chest. This felt different from the earlier skirmishes, more focused, more decisive. The undead seemed to be mustering for a direct assault on Winterfell's main gate. Perhaps the Night King believed the fortress had been worn down enough, or maybe he intended to test the powers he had fused into Daenerys. As if to confirm Jon's suspicions, he saw her raise one hand slowly, ice crystals spiraling around it. The air rippled with a cold so intense that even from a distance, Jon felt it, a biting wave that made his eyes water. Then she lowered her hand, and the whites surged forward as one. The watchers let loose arrows, and the hiss of shafts filled the air. Some found their marks, toppling a few whites. But the horde pressed on, clambering over one another with mindless ferocity. The ground quaked beneath their collective force. A few undead giants lumbered among them, roaring with choked, guttural sounds. From the ramparts, Grey Worm shouted commands to the Unsullied, who prepared their spears in disciplined ranks behind the battered gates. Jon clenched the hilt of Longclaw, straining to see Daenerys. She stood back, not joining the charge, her posture rigid. As the whites approached the outer barricades, he caught a glimpse of Rhaegal and Drogon spiraling overhead. The dragons unleashed streams of fire that raked across the leading ranks of the undead. Bodies ignited, blackening the snow with greasy smoke. The stench of charred flesh wafted into the wind, but the horde did not falter. They shoved onward, unstoppable. A high, keening shriek split the chaos. Daenerys had stepped forward, a swirl of snow and frost dancing at her feet. Her gaze locked on the dragons above, and Jon saw her lips move in a soundless invocation. Immediately, an arctic gust roared upward, colliding with Drogon's flames, extinguishing them in a hiss of steam. Drogon bellowed in frustration, peeling away to avoid the wave of cold that threatened to freeze him mid-flight. Rhaegal circled behind, flapping his wings furiously, but he too could not sustain a torrent of flame under the Queen's icy wrath. The defenders on the walls cried out as the whites reached the first barrier, sharpened stakes and piles of debris. Many undead were impaled, their bodies jerking in silent agony. But more clambered over, hauling themselves atop the wriggling corpses of their fellows. The barricade slowed them, not enough to stop them. Arrows rained down, but the tide surged forward, unstoppable in its numbers. Then the gates trembled. The giants had arrived, swinging massive fists and clubs of blackened wood. One giant reared back, delivering a colossal blow that shook the walls of Winterfell. Jon braced himself against the crenellation, heart pounding. If those gates gave way, they would be overwhelmed in moments. Grey Worm and his Unsullied stood ready at ground level, but even their impeccable discipline might not withstand the brute force of undead giants combined with the teeming mass of whites. Every soul within these walls understood it. The next few moments would decide their fate. Jon shouted for the defenders to brace the gate with everything they had. A swarm of Northmen and free folk rushed down, jamming beams and rubble against the doors, reinforcing them from within. Another quake, another thunderous blow from the giant, and cracks snaked through the timber. The men on the ramparts exchanged fearful looks. The horn sounded again, an urgent signal to hold fast. Yet they all saw the unstoppable might of the giant's fists hammering relentlessly. Even if the gate did not yield immediately, the Horde would find a new way. They always did. Jon turned his gaze back to Daenerys. She had advanced just behind the line of undead giants, her hair and cloak billowing around her. That same flicker of recognition seemed to stir in her face when she looked upon the ramparts. Jon felt as though her eyes were fixed on him, even among the chaos. A memory rose in his mind. Their time at Dragonstone, poring over maps of Westeros, discussing how they might build a better world. It felt like a cruel dream now. Unable to bear it, Jon seized a torch from a nearby sconce and thrust it into a brazier of resin-soaked wood, setting it ablaze. Then he lifted the torch high, signaling to the dragons overhead. Drogon and Rhaegal roared in response, repositioning behind the fortress. Jon hoped to coordinate a direct blast of dragonfire down the approach, incinerating the largest cluster of wights and the giants near the gate. But Daenerys perceived the maneuver. Her lips moved again, and that lethal wave of cold ascended like a rising tide. The very air crackled with swirling flakes that glinted like tiny shards of glass. When the dragons exhaled their flame, it met the barrage of cold in midair, neutralizing much of the fire before it could reach the Horde. The few flames that got through set pockets of wights ablaze, but not nearly enough. The giants roared defiantly, unscathed. Jon felt a chill deeper than the wind creep through his bones. Daenerys was systematically negating their greatest advantage. He had to do something. Turning to the men around him, he said in a grim tone, "Cover me. I'm going down there." A nearby soldier gaped at him. "My lord, that's suicide." Jon shook his head, voice fierce. "We can't hold them at the gate for long. If I can distract Daenerys, break her hold on the dragon's flame, our chances improve." Even as he spoke, he recognized the reckless desperation of the plan. Yet he saw no alternative. Every passing moment brought the undead closer to breaching the walls entirely. Grey Worm emerged from a side stairwell, panting, his eyes wide with urgency. "The gate won't hold more than a few minutes. We need the dragon's fire. Otherwise, we're lost." Jon gripped his arm. "Keep the men steady. I'll do my best to draw her attention." Without further explanation, Jon sprinted down the staircase to the courtyard. The air was filled with the roar of combat. Arrows clattering, men shouting, the thunderous impact of giant fists. Somewhere above, the horns blew again, short and frantic. Jon forced himself forward, weaving through lines of unsullied as they braced for the breach. A surge of wights now climbed the walls themselves, scrabbling at the stones like spiders. Some defenders stabbed downward with spears, felling them, but more took their place. The sense of impending doom was suffocating. He reached a smaller side gate that opened onto the killing field before the main entrance. 2 Northmen guarded it, but Jon demanded they open it just enough for him to slip out. When they hesitated, he barked the command again, reminding them of their sworn duty. With grim reluctance, they complied. The cold assaulted him instantly as he stepped through. Snow whipped into his face, nearly blinding him. He fought his way around a collapsed section of the palisade, venturing out into the open, where the weight of the undead presence pressed like an invisible hand against his chest. The wights, bent on battering the main gate, had not yet noticed him. He scanned the frenzy until he found Daenerys. She stood maybe 40 paces to the right of the giant, her face pale and emotionless, her gaze fixed on the fortress. Jon's heart thudded. He forced breath into his lungs and began to move toward her, gripping Longclaw in one hand. Each step felt like a dream, slow and surreal. He came within shouting distance before she turned. The swirl of snow parted around her, revealing the unearthly sheen of her eyes. Jon almost faltered. Even changed as she was, she looked heartbreakingly beautiful, like some statue carved from moonlit ice. He swallowed, letting the tip of Longclaw drop to the ground, an unspoken plea in his face. She regarded him with an expression caught between recognition and detachment. "Dany," he whispered, barely audible over the wind. "Daenerys, please." Her lips parted, but no words came. The swirling frost around her intensified, a physical manifestation of her conflict. He stepped closer, arms trembling at his sides. Behind her, A group of whites shuffled, sensing prey. But they did not advance, perhaps because the Night Kings will restrain them. Daenerys lifted a hand, pale fingers outstretched, as though to ward Jon off or to beckon him closer. He couldn't tell. His breath came in ragged clouds. "It's me," Jon said, voice tight with emotion. "Jon Dada. You remember?" "Not at all." A faint shimmer crossed her eyes, and for a fleeting instant, he saw a glimmer of warmth there, a light that flickered in the ice. His hope soared. She stepped forward, uncertain, her expression warring between the Night King's thrall and her old self. The swirl of frost slowed, becoming almost gentle, as if the storm had paused. He dared to take another step, raising his free hand, palm out. He saw her mouth move, a soft broken sound escaping. "Jon." It was barely a whisper, but it was her voice, not the voice of a white or a white walker. His heart hammered so hard he could hardly breathe. Tears froze at the corners of his eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat constricted. Then a shadow loomed at her back. The Night King, silent as a specter, ice blade in hand. Jon had no idea how the ancient creature had approached so quickly. Panic seized him. He cried out, lunging forward with Longclaw. The Night King twisted aside, faster than any mortal, and swung that dreadful blade. Sparks flew where it met Jon's Valyrian steel. The impact numbed Jon's arm. Daenerys staggered away, clutching her head as though in pain. The whites converged at once, forming a protective ring around her and their king. Jon tried to press the attack, but the Night King's strength was inhuman. Each clash jarred him to the core. Frost bit at his lungs. He saw nothing but those cold, inhuman eyes, reflecting no emotion. One slash nearly knocked Longclaw from his grip, and he stumbled back, struggling to keep his footing on the slick ground. In the swirl of chaos, he lost sight of Daenerys, though he heard her cry out in anguish somewhere behind that ring of undead. He roared, hacking at the whites, cutting down several. Their bodies collapsed, but they were immediately replaced by more. Then the Night King struck with a brutal overhead blow, forcing Jon to raise Longclaw in desperate defense. The force drove him to his knees. His muscles burned. He tried to push back, but the Night King pressed down, unyielding. In the periphery of Jon's vision, he glimpsed Daenerys sinking to the ground, her pale fingers digging into the snow as if battling a seizure of the soul. The swirling frost around her flickered from furious to subdued and back again, like two storms clashing for dominance in her mind. Summoning a last burst of strength, Jon wrenched himself sideways, letting the Night King's blade slide off Longclaw. He tumbled awkwardly, rolling across the frozen ground. A white lunged for him, and he managed to decapitate it with a backhanded slash. Another followed, claws raking at his shoulder. He kicked it away, panting, eyes searching for Daenerys. She was half upright now, staring at him with a torment that cut him to the quick. He wanted to shout her name, to beg her to fight the darkness. But the Night King loomed again, forcing him to defend. Jon's arms felt like lead. Each second spent battling was a second lost to saving Daenerys from the internal struggle. He parried another blow, reeling from the jolt. Meanwhile, behind the undead king, Daenerys slowly rose, face contorted in an agonized grimace, frost swirling in violent eddies around her feet. Her eyes were locked onto Jon's. He sensed that this was a pivotal moment. Some last vestige of her humanity was raging to the surface. The Night King, either unaware or unconcerned, raised his blade once more, aiming for Jon's head. Jon barely managed to interpose Longclaw, but the impact was brutal. He fell onto his back, breath exploding from his lungs in a pained gasp. The next strike would be fatal. He had no chance to dodge. Then, from behind, Daenerys' voice rang out, raw, anguished, terrible. The Night King hesitated, turning his head. Jon blinked, uncertain what he was seeing. Daenerys reached for the Night King with trembling hands, and the swirl of frost around her condensed into razor-like shards. Her eyes blazed with conflicting energies, an inner war of flame and ice. With a sudden cry, she thrust her hands forward, unleashing a vortex of white mist that enveloped the Night King. He staggered, shock registering in his ancient gaze. The whites shrieked in unison, as if the bond tying them to their master had quivered under a powerful blow. Jon seized the chance. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and swung Longclaw at the Night King's back. The blade bit deep, unleashing a cracking sound like rending ice. The Night King whirled, eyes full of fathomless hatred. But the blow had weakened him. Frost spread across the wound, and for an instant, his entire form shimmered, as if on the verge of breaking. But Daenerys' strength faltered just as suddenly as it had risen. She recoiled, clutching her head. A pained sob caught in her throat. The Night King seized that moment of reprieve. He tore himself away from Jon's blade, unleashing a shockwave of icy magic that knocked Jon off his feet and hurled him back into the snow. In a single blurred motion, he seized Daenerys by the arm and pulled her close. The swirling frost flared with renewed fury, as though he was reclaiming his hold on her. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in his grasp. "No," Jon roared, trying to lunge forward. A half-dozen whites intercepted him, latching onto his arms and legs. He slashed desperately, but more whites piled on, their claws digging through his cloak. The storm whipped around them, a veil of snow that obscured everything. In that white tempest, Jon only saw a final glimpse of the Night King carrying Daenerys away, his spiked crown disappearing into the swirl. The tide of undead followed in a grotesque wave, forced to retreat by some silent command. Then the storm closed in, and Jon lost sight of her entirely. He fought free of the whites, hacking them apart with savage fury, ignoring the frigid burn of their touches. By the time he stood unencumbered, panting, sword dripping with foul black ichor, the Night King and Daenerys were gone. The horde had pulled back like a retreating tide. A scattering of whites still lurked, easily dispatched by Winterfell's archers. But the bulk had vanished into the dawn gloom. Jon fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow, numb with rage and sorrow. He realized he was sobbing, though tears refused to form in the stabbing cold. The adrenaline drained from his limbs, leaving him trembling. She had broken free for a heartbeat. He had seen it. But now the Night King had tightened his grip. Time and again, they tore her from his grasp, and each time, the cost grew. The fortress gates groaned open, and Grey Worm rushed out, followed by a handful of Unsullied and Northmen. They helped Jon to his feet, surrounding him, checking his wounds. The battered defenders surveyed the burned and broken remains of the battlefield. Dozens of whites lay in smoldering heaps. One of the undead giants had collapsed, its massive frame half dissolved by dragonfire. But any sense of relief was overshadowed by exhaustion and despair. They had defended Winterfell another day, but they had not won. The Night King would return, and Daenerys was still lost to them. Jon's gaze lingered on the spot where she had stood. He replayed the brief moment she called his name. The flicker in her eyes that hinted at a raging conflict within. A faint hope, fleeting as a candle in a gale. He knew now that she still fought from inside the prison of ice. That knowledge both comforted and tormented him. There must be a way to save her, or she would not have manifested such defiance. But how much longer could she fight against the Night King's will? As he stumbled back toward the gate, with Grey Worm's support, the wind howled around them like a lament, carrying the promise of more bloodshed. The defenders trudged into the courtyard, battered and blinking in the thin gray light of a new morning. Each person dreaded the next day, the next night, the next heartbreak. For now, the fighting had ceased. But winter's grip only tightened, and Daenerys Targaryen, somewhere in that frozen wasteland, stood at the heart of a storm that threatened to swallow the living whole. The slender thread of hope lay in the knowledge that her spirit was not yet fully extinguished. She burned still, however faintly, beneath the ice. And Jon Snow clung to that ember as though it was the last light in a world gone dark. In the hours that followed the hasty retreat of the undead, Winterfell's courtyard felt more like a graveyard than a fortress that had, momentarily at least, survived another onslaught. Snow drifted through the shattered gates, brushing over the corpses of whites and a handful of the living who had not made it back in time. Jon stood amid the wreckage, a cloak of silence enveloping him, cold wind nipping at his cheeks. He could not stop replaying the moment Daenerys had broken through. if only for an instant. Her eyes had shone with something recognizable, an echo of the woman he loved, before the Night King reclaimed her. Now she was gone again, and he had little to show for it, but bruises and a deeper ache in his heart. Grey Worm's voice, clipped and precise, cut through the hush as he directed the Unsullied to gather the wounded. A few Northmen pitched in with building a makeshift barricade to replace the battered gate. The giant's final blows had torn yawning cracks in the timbers. They would hold no longer. Jon watched the defenders work in grim silence, saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the slump in their shoulders. Every day, they whittled down resources, morale, and numbers. Every day, the dead returned in forces that never seemed to diminish. The conclusion felt inevitable, a slow strangulation at Winter's hands. Yet he could not bring himself to kneel to that despair. "Tormund's inside trying to warm up," Grey Worm said quietly as he approached. His voice carried the subtle hoarseness of a man who had seen too many nightmares and pressed on regardless. "We lost 30 men in that last push. More wounded." Jon clenched his jaw and closed his eyes for a second. "Could have been more," he muttered, though the words were bitter in his mouth. "We saw them pull back. Maybe that saved us from a worse fate. But they'll come again." Grey Worm gave a curt nod. "Do we have a plan, my lord?" The question held no judgment. He asked merely because a commander must ask, because soldiers needed something to cling to. But in his dark eyes, Jon sensed a flicker of doubt. Jon inhaled slowly, glancing up at the ramparts. The sky was a dull gray, streaked with paler bands of early morning. The storm of the undead had passed, but it would be back. "We gather, regroup, tend to the wounded. I'll speak with Tyrion, see if he's found any new insight in those dusty scrolls of his." Then he frowned. "And I'll talk to Tormund. The free folk know the far north. The old magic's better than we do. Maybe there's something we're missing." Grey Worm pressed his fist to his chest, the faintest sign of respect, and moved off to oversee the barricade building. Jon lingered a moment longer, letting the wind lash his face. His breath came out in wavering clouds, each exhalation whispering, "Failure, failure, failure." The vow he had made, to protect Daenerys, to stand with her as they liberated the realm, felt hollow now. Yet he refused to let go entirely. She was still inside that pale husk, fighting to break free. He had seen it, and if there was the barest shred of a chance, he would cling to it. With stiff limbs, he trudged across the courtyard, sidestepping clusters of bodies that soldiers gently covered with threadbare blankets. At the fortress interior, a wave of warmth enveloped him. Relative warmth, at least. Someone had lit all available braziers in the entrance hall, hoping to stave off the chill for the wounded who lay on pallets. The moans of pain lingered in the air. Gilly knelt at one side, pressing a fresh rag to a soldier's feverish brow. A cluster of northern healers struggled to keep pace, rummaging through crates of bandages that were almost depleted. The entire place smelled of blood, pine resin, and a stale tang that caught in the throat. Tormund sat on a stool near one of the larger braziers, wrapped in furs. His teeth no longer chattered, but he looked gaunt, face hollowed by the nightmares he had witnessed. Jon approached, quietly placing a hand on Tormund's shoulder. The wildling exhaled slowly, turning his gaze to meet Jon's. For a moment, neither spoke, though Tormund's expression was weighed with regret. "You saved my life out there, Jon," Tormund said at last, voice still rasping. "I should be the one helping you now, but my people, were not many left. I lost track of them. The ones who survive might make their way here, but I can't promise anything." "None." Jon nodded, drawing a step closer to the brazier's fire. It flickered, casting irregular shadows on Tormund's broad face. "We're grateful for every soul who stands with us," he said quietly. "It's no easier here. Every time they come, we lose more than we can spare." Tormund eyed the wounded across the hall, brow creasing. "I saw her, you know, your queen, out there in the snow. Never thought I'd see a person half made of ice. That was a grim sight, Jon." Jon swallowed. "She nearly broke free of his hold," he said, voice trembling on the edge of hope and sorrow. "I saw it in her eyes. She was fighting him, but it wasn't enough." He closed his eyes. "We need a way to break the Night King's hold once and for all, to free her from this curse." Or else, the realm is doomed. A flicker of sympathy crossed Tormund's face. He set his jaw and nodded. Up in the true north, there were always tales about the White Walkers, things mothers told children to make them behave. Some said that a White Walker born from a living person could be freed, if touched by flame, from their own blood. Some said the only escape was being put in the ground. None of us knew the truth. They always seemed like legends, until you and I saw them. Daenerys. Jon felt his pulse quicken. Touched by flame? From their own blood? He recalled Tyrion's repeated speculation that Daenerys carried a spark of old magic in her Targaryen lineage. She's fire-made flesh, but the Night King has turned her. Could some reflection of her old power, her dragon's flame perhaps, still do it? Done. Tormund shrugged, big shoulders shifting. Maybe. But you told me she's already shrugged off dragon fire as if it were an icy wind. Seems her cold half fights it, might need something deeper than a simple flame. Then he paused, glancing around. I'm only repeating stories told by old men in half-broken huts. Don't build your hope on it. Jon gave a wan nod of acknowledgement. Still, the rumor stoked the embers of Tyrion's cryptic line. Fire meets ice in the forging of souls. If some deep meeting of flame and her own flesh could be engineered, maybe it would sever the chain. But how? When she was constantly under the Night King's watchful eye. When she quashed dragon fire with a single gesture. A faint tap of boots sounded on the stone floor behind them. Jon turned to find Arya there, silent and intense as ever. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair pulled back in a rough tie. She nodded to Tormund, then looked to Jon. In her gaze he read a quiet urgency, though her voice remained cool. They're asking for you up in the solar, she said. Tyrion, Sansa, Davos Dushtari. They're waiting. They. Jon exchanged a look with Tormund, who waved a dismissive hand. Go on, talk to your lords and ladies. I'll try to get some rest in this giant crypt you call a castle. The corner of his mouth twitched with an attempt at humor, though it failed to mask the weariness in his eyes. Jon squeezed Tormund's shoulder, then followed Arya through the cavernous corridor, passing more wounded. Her footsteps were soundless, an echo of the assassin training she had once received. He wondered how many times she had slipped beyond the walls at night, scouting the enemy lines, risking her life. One of these days, the Whites would detect her. The notion filled him with dread, but he also knew better than to forbid Arya from doing anything. She moved by her own code, unstoppable as the wind. They arrived at a heavy wooden door, guarded by a single Unsullied who stepped aside at once. Arya pushed the door open, and Jon stepped into the solar, one of the few rooms in Winterfell that still held some vestige of warmth. A hearth crackled at the far wall, while a small window admitted a dreary light. Tyrion stood at a table strewn with books, scrolls, and half-melted candles. Sansa and Davos were conferring in low voices near the fire. Both turned as Jon entered. Sansa's face was grimly set, a deep worry etched in her features. Davos offered a polite dip of his head, though the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Tyrion raked a hand through his hair, which stuck out in odd angles from restless nights. Jon, he said in that hushed, urgent tone he had adopted of late. I assume you've heard we had partial success out there. You reached Daenerys for a heartbeat, but not long enough. Yes. Jon stepped forward, glancing at the chaos of scrolls. One in particular caught his eye. He recognized the scrawled phrase Tyrion had shown him before. When fire meets ice in the forging of souls, the chain may yet break. Tyrion had circled it several times in ink, lines branching out with scribbled notes. Sansa folded her arms. She looked colder than usual, as though exhaustion had whittled her patience down to the bone. Jon, we can't keep hurling our men into hopeless battles. We're on the verge of collapse. If we don't find a solution soon, this entire castle will become our tomb. Jon took a moment to study her face, longing to offer some comfort. I know, he said gently. That's why we need to discuss every possible angle. Tormund told me an old legend about a living person who'd been turned into a White Walker, but freed by a flame from their own blood. Does that ring any bells from your reading, Tyrion? Tyrion exhaled, tugging at the loose collar of his tunic. It does in a way. Different words, same concept, scattered across old texts. All revolve around the idea that if someone was transformed, the key to shattering that bond lay in reawakening the primal magic in their blood. For Daenerys, that's Targaryen fire. The trick is, how do we force that spark to burn through the ice when she actively suppresses dragonfire? And Arya, who had slipped in quietly behind Jon, spoke up. We have more than one dragon, but they can't even aim a proper blast at her without her snuffing it out. You'd have to catch her by surprise. Her voice carried a note of cold practicality. But she's never alone. The Night King is always close, or the Whites are. They protect her like she's some prize. Sansa shook her head with a growing dismay. Even if we managed to distract him, we'd have to do it at exactly the right moment. One misstep, and the dragons might kill her, or the Night King might kill us all. Davos, leaning on a cane that he had acquired after sustaining a nasty leg injury in a previous battle, cleared his throat. We might consider a smaller party. Something stealthy. She's led the attacks on these walls, but that's not every hour of the day. Perhaps if we find their lair, where the Night King is keeping her when not attacking, we can catch them off guard. His eyes flicked around the table, uncertain. Dangerous. Possibly suicidal. Tyrion murmured, tapping a quill restlessly. But waiting here to starve or freeze is no better. I found references to the Heart of Winter in a few tomes. A fortress or region in the far north, beyond the Frostfangs. It could be where the Night King retreats between assaults. But we have no maps, no safe routes. Jon frowned, recalling vague mention of such a place in old legends. That's where he's taken her. We'd never survive the journey. Even if we did, it'd take too long. Winterfell would fall in our absence. He stared at the flickering light of the hearth, remembering the intensity of Daenerys' eyes when she had spoken his name. For all their talk of cunning and stealth, the simplest truth struck him. If Daenerys was to break free, it had to happen in the crucible of another confrontation. Only the heat of that pitched battle might force the dormant flame in her blood to clash with the Night King's power. But orchestrating such a scenario was next to impossible. Tyrion's gaze fell to the phrase once more. We might not need to physically hold her in dragonfire, he said slowly. If she can be brought to connect with that old Targaryen magic in another way, like some emotional trigger, maybe that's enough. It happened before, when her dragons hatched. But that was a very specific set of circumstances. He trailed off, remembering how Daenerys had walked into Drogo's funeral pyre. That had been an act of love and sacrifice, a moment of impossible synergy between her spirit and the flames. Jon thought of that story often. Was there a way to replicate something akin to that moment in the frigid wastes of the north? And even if such a miracle were possible, how did they prevent the Night King from intervening? Arya's sharp eyes flicked to Jon. She recognized you out there, she said quietly. I saw her lips form your name. You need to keep reaching her. If she can hold on to that for a moment longer, it might create the opening we need. Jon felt his chest tighten, a mixture of hope and dread. He hated the thought of using her feelings as a weapon, but there was no alternative. So we lure her close. I plead with her. Try to break the Night King's hold long enough for the dragons to strike. We'd have to time it perfectly, so she's not able to block their flame, and so it doesn't kill her. Sansa gave a slight shake of her head. That's a razor's edge, Jon. One slip, and we either destroy her or waste the chance. Or you die if the Night King realizes what you're doing. I am willing to take that risk, Jon said, the steadiness in his voice surprising even himself. She risked everything to fight for the living. She lost Jorah, Missandei, thousands of soldiers. I won't abandon her because it's dangerous. Nah. No one argued. The hush that followed was thick with apprehension. At length, Tyrion nodded. Then we prepare. Fortify. Gather what's left of our strength. If the Night King attempts another grand assault, we meet him with every defense we have. But hold a small force in reserve. Those waves with Valyrian steel, the dragons overhead, anything that might tip the balance. Meanwhile, you confront Daenerys again. What if we fail? Sansa asked softly. her gaze flicking around the room. What if the chain can't be broken? Jon's jaw tightened. He looked to the floor. Then we do what we must to keep the realm safe, he forced out. Even if it means putting her to rest. The words tasted of ashes in his mouth, but he said them for Sansa's benefit, for the realm's. He could see she was poised to remind him of his duty if he faltered. A weighty silence settled in the solar. Outside, the moan of the wind through broken windows reminded them the next battle might come at any time. Finally, Davos cleared his throat. Well, that's more of a plan than we had yesterday. Let me see to the men on the walls. Let them know to be ready for anything. I'll post watchers day and night. If they see a hint of movement from that damned horde, we'll know. No one. With that, they dispersed. Arya lingered only a moment, her gaze lingering on Jon with the faintest glint of concern. Then she vanished into the corridor. Sansa walked out with Tyrion, their voices low. Jon watched them go, feeling older than his years. For a time he stood alone by the hearth, letting the warmth lick at his fingers, trying to recall how it felt to truly be warm. The memory eluded him. He heard a step behind him, softer than Arya's. Turning, he found Sansa had paused in the doorway, arms folded. Her red hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and in her eyes he read the swirl of love and worry that only a sibling could show. "Jon," she said gently. "Just be careful, please. I don't want to lose you." He managed a small nod. "I don't want to lose you either or anyone else. But I can't let Daenerys remain under his power." Sansa's lips tightened, and she inclined her head in farewell, leaving him alone with the sputter of the fire and the quiet rasp of his own breath. Days passed, marked by a tense lull. The undead attacked in small waves, testing the walls, but not in the overwhelming numbers they had seen before. Each time, the defenders repelled them with arrows and the occasional blast of dragonfire, mindful not to let Daenerys come too close. Jon worried she might sense their strategy, but so far, her appearances were fleeting. A pale figure in the distance or on the flank. He glimpsed her once, faintly, beyond a swirl of falling snow. She made no move to advance. The undead parted for her as though she were royalty indeed. But he could not approach. The terrain was thick with wights. The moment he tried to leave the safety of the walls, the enemy would surge. So he waited, heart pounding in frustration, hoping the Night King was biding his time for a final blow, and that Winterfell could withstand it. In those uneasy stretches, Tormund recovered his strength enough to join Grey Worm on nightly patrols along the battlements. The two men, so different in their backgrounds, gained a strange camaraderie as they peered into the darkness for signs of the next assault. Sansa and Tyrion oversaw ration distribution, making sure the wounded received enough to keep going. Arya slipped out several times to gather what intelligence she could, sometimes returning with fresh bruises or cuts. She said little about what she found, only that the undead seemed to circle Winterfell, as though waiting for the perfect moment. Jon found occasional reprieve by the Godswood, where the ancient weirwood tree stood, its red leaves stark against the snowfall. The old face carved into the trunk gazed impassively upon him, its eyes weeping crimson sap. He took to praying there, though he wasn't sure to which gods. The old gods. The new? The sense of them listening felt distant, as if overshadowed by the bleak presence beyond the walls. Yet he found some small solace kneeling on the frozen ground, remembering how once, not long ago, Daenerys had walked beside him in these same gardens, uncertain but hopeful about forging alliances. Life had been simpler then. One late afternoon, while he lingered at that tree, he heard a soft tread of boots in the snow. He glanced over his shoulder to see Tyrion approaching with slow steps, breath puffing in clouds. "I should have guessed I'd find you here," Tyrion said quietly, stopping a few paces away. "I'd join you in prayer, but I'm afraid the gods and I have a complicated relationship." Jon stood, brushing frost from his cloak. "Ace do I?" he admitted. "But I needed quiet." He studied Tyrion's face, the lines of strain that had become permanent. "Is something wrong?" "Everything's wrong," Tyrion replied, not unkindly. But specifically, the watchers on the eastern rampart reported a large mass of wights moving in that direction. Grey Worm believes it's the beginning of another siege. Perhaps the final one. The way they're moving suggests momentum. Jon's heartbeat quickened. Then the Night King might make his move. That's what we've been waiting for, isn't it? We hold the walls, keep his forces engaged, while Yes, Tyrion said, cutting him off gently. While you try to reach Daenerys, we'll do our best to occupy the Night King. Though how we manage that is another question. He seems impervious to everything but Valyrian steel and dragonfire. We'll have to be creative. Jon exhaled, breath fogging the air. With station archers on the south walls, open them up for an angle on the Horde's flank. Rhaegal and Drogon can strafe from above. We have a few barrels of wildfire left from King's Landing, do we not? No. Tyrion nodded. A precious supply. We'd hoped never to use it, but these are desperate times. It could buy you a moment. Maybe the undead lines will scatter if we detonate it at the right spot. Then we'll do so. Gather the men. Tonight or tomorrow we may face them again. Jon turned back to the weirwood, resting a hand against the cool bark. I'll be ready. Tyrion hesitated. Jon, if it doesn't work, if the hold on her is too strong, then I'll do what needs to be done, Jon said in a flat tone, swallowing the pain that rose in his throat. Now go. Gather everyone. I'll meet you in the Great Hall soon. Tyrion nodded and left. Jon stayed, pressing his forehead to the bark of the godswood tree, letting the cold sap stain his brow. A memory flickered. Daenerys in Dragonstone. Pride in her eyes as she spoke of breaking the wheel. He wondered if the gods could be so cruel as to let such a fate befall her after all she had done. Was there no mercy in this world? He whispered her name into the hush. Night fell swiftly, as if drawn by a dark hand. The watchers on the walls confirmed the undead mass had grown, a teeming ocean of animated corpses. If one listened closely, one might hear their scraping, slithering sounds in the distance. A hideous lullaby. The great hall buzzed with quiet tension as Jon outlined the plan with Grey Worm, Tormund, Davos, and a few remaining northern lords. Sansa observed from a corner, face pale but resolute, while Tyrion pored over a map. The wildfire barrels were to be stationed at the eastern approach. Once the undead were fully committed, archers would loose flaming arrows into the barrels, triggering an explosion that could decimate hundreds of wights. That might give Jon the brief opening needed to draw Daenerys away from the main fray. It'll be chaos, Tormund muttered, rubbing the fresh scar on his cheek. Hard for you to find her in all that madness. Jon gazed at the map where Tyrion had sketched approximate positions of the enemy. Shall be near the center. That's where the Night King likes to position himself. Once the whites are fully engaged, I'll slip from the western postern gate and move behind their flank. If the dragons can keep overhead cover, I might reach her. He paused, eyes flicking to Grey Worm. Coordinate with the archers carefully. A single arrow is all it takes to set off the wildfire. Make sure no one's in the blast radius. Grey Worm gave a short nod. We'll do it. But after that, there won't be any more wildfire left. It's our last big trick. A hush settled over them, each man and woman aware that they were gambling everything on this final attempt. In the corner, Sansa exhaled softly, then stepped forward. She reached out, gripping Jon's hand. Her eyes shone with tears that refused to fall. Then let's not waste it, she said, voice quivering with repressed emotion. We make our stand here, and if the gods are just, we'll pull her back from the brink. Jon squeezed her hand in return, then gently released it. Around them the others nodded, each with their own burden of fear. Tyrion turned, quietly clearing his throat, and said, I suggest we get some rest if we can. Dawn is only a few hours away, and I suspect by midday, if not sooner, we'll see the enemy at our gates. They parted, offering hushed farewells. Tormund clasped Jon's forearm, the old wildling gesture of solidarity, then exited with Grey Worm to ensure the men were fully armed. Davos ambled off, leaning on his cane, muttering about double-checking the arrow supplies. Tyrion set about tidying the scattered maps, though his hands trembled so much that the parchment slipped from his grasp. Sansa followed him out, eyes distant. Soon Jon found himself alone in the great hall, save for a single torch sputtering near the dais. He recalled grand feasts in this hall, roaring fires, laughter, the promise of victory. Now the space felt hollow, the ghosts of past joys mocking him. Wearily he climbed the steps to the dais and sank onto the seat that once belonged to the lords of Winterfell. He was no lord in truth. Or perhaps he was, but it hardly mattered now. Titles were dust in this new age of ice and terror. The torchlight traced the lines of the old carvings in the seat's wooden arms. He ran his fingers over the grain, thinking of Ned Stark, the father he had loved, though not his father by blood. Still, Eddard Stark's legacy had shaped him, taught him the meaning of honor and duty. Would Ned have found a better way to save Daenerys? Or would he say that sometimes the honorable choice was the hardest one? Exhaustion tugged at Jon's mind, urging him to lie down, to let oblivion claim him for an hour or two. Yet his thoughts churned. He pictured Daenerys' face, half changed, pale eyes glowing with unnatural light. He told himself that the woman he knew was still there, buried under the frozen mantle, that her heart still beat for the realm, for him, for the future they had hoped to build. The memory of her calling his name on the battlefield replayed in his mind, refusing to fade. Eventually, the weight of fatigue won tide. He let his head tip back, closed his eyes, and drifted into a restless doze. His dreams were fragmented, teeming with images of dragons made of ice, skeleton armies pounding at the gates. Daenerys appeared in a swirl of frost, tears frozen on her cheeks as she reached for him. Then the Night King's shadow stretched between them, and she vanished into darkness. He woke with a start, heart hammering. The torch burned nearly out beside him. A faint light filtered through the arrow slits near the rafters, heralding the approach of dawn. The horns blared soon after, echoing through Winterfell's stone corridors. Jon shot to his feet, adrenaline banishing sleep. He rushed to the courtyard where men and women scrambled to take positions on the walls. From the top of the steps, he saw the eastern side of the fortress thronged with archers and spearmen. The great barrels of wildfire, hidden under tarps, were positioned on wagons near the battered outer walls. Davos barked orders, gesturing for archers to hold their fire until the undead pressed into the kill zone. Overhead, Rhaegal and Drogon soared, their silhouettes stark against a gray sunrise. The dragons' cries reverberated like thunder across the plain. Jon forced his way through the bustle to join Grey Worm and Tormund near the main gate, which had been hastily repaired but still looked precarious. Sansa stood off to the side, flanked by a few northern archers, her face pale but resolute. Tyrion hovered next to her, wearing a dagger on his belt, though whether he'd get a chance to use it remained uncertain. Already the Watchers shouted sightings. The undead host was on the move, coming from the east in undulating ranks. A tremor of fear rippled across the defenders. For the white seemed endless, a black wave against the whiteness of the field. Jon's stomach knotted. It was time to put their plan in motion, or at least wait for the proper moment. "Hold the lines," Davos roared from atop the walkway. "We don't light the barrels until the main host is within range. Archers make every shot count." Jon nodded to Tormund, then clapped Grey Worm on the shoulder. "You hold them here. Once they're committed, I'll circle around to the postern gate and try to find her." He paused, searching the battlefield with narrowed eyes. He had to spot Daenerys. If she wasn't in the vanguard, she'd be somewhere behind. Perhaps the Night King was content to watch them break themselves against his horde before unveiling her. Tormund offered a toothy, if nervous, grin. "Go on, crows. I'll keep them from chewing your legs off." Jon mustered a faint smile, then hurried off, weaving through the scrambling defenders toward a discreet side gate in the western wall. Only a pair of men guarded it. They nodded at Jon's approach, yanked on the heavy chain to lift the small iron portcullis just enough for him to slip through. Beyond was a narrow footpath that curved around Winterfell's perimeter, flanked by jagged stone rubble from a collapsed tower. Snow whirled about him. The roar of the wind grew as soon as he stepped beyond the thick walls, carrying the distant clamor of wights and the pounding of war drums that existed only in the living's hearts. He peered east, seeing the faint silhouettes of the undead beginning their charge. The wide field between them and Winterfell was pitted with old trenches and stakes from previous battles, yet the wights navigated them relentlessly. He heard the first volley of arrows hiss through the air, striking a forward line of corpses. A handful dropped, limp, but others climbed over the fallen. Jon moved quickly, crouching low. The plan was to loop around the fortress, find a vantage point behind the mass of whites, and hope that by the time the wildfire erupted, he might slip close to Daenerys. If that explosion scattered some of the horde, he might just have a chance to speak with her again. That chance felt infinitesimal, but it was all he had. He advanced through drifting snow, pausing at times behind rocky outcrops. The shrieks of the whites grew louder, an unnatural chorus of the dead. Above, the dragons roared, unleashing gouts of flame that slashed across the sky in arcs of blinding orange. He saw momentary flashes where undead ranks were consumed by dragonfire, but also glimpsed pulses of frosty air dampening the flames, preventing them from sweeping across the entire battlefield. She must be there, he thought, scanning the chaos. The unnatural cold that suffocated the dragon's fire was her doing. He crept further, nearly stumbling over a half-buried body in the snow. One of Winterfell's men who had fallen in a prior skirmish, already stiff and unrecognizable. Jon swallowed the nausea creeping up his throat. Keep moving. The ground trembled with the footfalls of the monstrous undead giants. He heard their bellowing roars, reminiscent of avalanches. A few times, he glimpsed the giant silhouettes, towering masses with rotted flesh clinging to massive bones. The living's arrows pricked them like needles. Then a sharp, percussive boom rattled the air. Wildfire. The plan had begun. A flaring green light illuminated the eastern sky, accompanied by screams and shrieks of both men and whites. Jon pushed forward, the swirling snow tinted with an eerie glow. Another boom followed. He pictured Davos on the wall, signaling the archers to ignite the barrels at the precise moment the whites were thickest in that sector. If the defenders timed it right, a swath of undead would be incinerated. He prayed to the old gods and knew that no living men were caught in the blast. With the horizon lit by green flame and the whites presumably reeling, Jon sprinted to higher ground, clambering atop a small ridge that overlooked the eastern approach. From there, he could see the undead host shifting in confusion around the pockets of green fire that crackled and popped, spreading in hungry bursts. Body parts littered the scorched snow, a ghastly scene. Yet countless whites remained, surging around the fires, picking their way toward Winterfell's walls. The acrid stench of wildfire burned Jon's nostrils, even at this distance. His gaze swept across the chaos, searching. Where was she? A flicker of motion drew his eye, a pale shape gliding through the swirling snow near the rear of the main cluster. He squinted, heart leaping. Daenerys. She stood alone, or nearly so, her silver-white hair snapping in the wind. Her cloak or gown, whatever it was, blew around her in tattered edges of ice-like fabric. The Night King was nowhere to be seen at that exact moment, which meant either he was fighting somewhere else or lurking in the shadows. If she was briefly unguarded, this might be Jon's only chance. He scrambled down the ridge, slipping on hidden patches of ice. By the time he regained his footing, the swirl of battle had shifted again. Screams echoed from the fortress walls as living and dead clashed. Jon pressed on, pushing through thigh-high drifts, weaving between shattered lumps of whites. He tried to ignore the disembodied arms that still twitched in the snow. The wildfire's glow cast monstrous shadows over everything. Closer and closer he came, until he was mere yards from Daenerys. Her back was to him. She faced Winterfell's battered gate, hands raised as if summoning another wave of that cold magic. Jon paused behind a half-broken mound of rubble. His breath rasped in his throat, adrenaline pounding through his veins. If he was to break through to her, it had to be now. He rose, sword drawn but held low in a non-threatening posture. "Daenerys!" he shouted, voice raw in the howling wind. "Dany, please." She spun around, eyes wide with that unnatural blue sheen. But there was a flicker of recognition, just as before. Her lips parted, though no sound emerged. Swirls of ice-laced air coiled around her. Jon approached, step by cautious step, ignoring the moans of whites in the distance. This close, he could sense her power, something that felt like standing amid a winter tempest. "It's me," he said, voice trembling. Jon Snow. Aegon Targaryen. However, you knew me. You remember, don't you? His gaze roved over her features, searching for any sign of life. Her pupils dilated slightly, as if wrestling with a memory. He dared another step. Fight him. He's not here right now. You can break free. I know you can. She clenched her jaw. The swirling cold intensified, but she did not fling it at him. Wisps of frost danced around her hands, though they flickered uncertainly. Jon realized, with a thud of relief, that she was hesitating. Her lips moved again in a whisper he could barely hear over the wind. "Jon." He almost sagged with relief. "Yes," he breathed, bridging the final yards between them. Slowly he raised a gloved hand, reaching for her. His pulse hammered so loudly that he could scarcely think. Her eyes gleamed with that unnatural glow. But behind it, he saw the ghost of her old self, a flicker of the woman who had loved him, who had forged a path of fire and blood yet strove to free the oppressed. Then came a snarl from behind her. The whites had noticed him at last. A cluster of them lunged toward Jon, weapons raised, jaws gaping in silent fury. Daenerys turned sharply, eyes flaring with an icy command. The whites halted mid-charge, as though forcibly restrained. Jon sized that moment, stepping beside her, voice tight with urgency. "You see, you can hold them back. You're stronger than him. You're Daenerys Stormborn, the unburnt. You don't serve the darkness." Her face contorted. He saw anguish in her features, lines of heartbreak. The swirling frost around her flickered with violent energy, as though two storms clashed for dominance in her veins. One wind whipped at Jon's cloak, stinging his cheeks, but still he stood firm, refusing to back away. He moved closer, so close he could see the faint trembling of her pale lashes. Carefully he reached out and touched her cheek with his gloved hand. It was cold as marble. "Come back," he whispered. "Please." For the briefest instant, he saw tears gather in her eyes, crystallizing before they could fall. A shimmer of warmth flitted across her expression. He thought she might truly break free. But then the air pulsed with malevolent power. In one terrifying lurch, the swirling cold turned savage, slamming into Jon's chest and hurling him backward. He hit the snow with a jarring impact, vision reeling. The Night King materialized at Daenerys' side, silent as a wraith. His pale, icy skin seemed to glow in the eerie half-light of the wildfire. He cast one chilling glance at Jon, then laid a possessive hand on Daenerys' shoulder. She gasped, face twisting, as though she were being dragged underwater by some unstoppable current. The whites, freed from her momentary restraint, lunged toward Jon again. Shaken and winded, Jon rolled aside, narrowly dodging a jagged blade. He came up swinging with Longclaw, severing a white at the waist. Another lunged for him, and he sank the Valyrian steel deep into its chest. He risked a desperate glance at Daenerys. She gripped the Night King's arm, her features contorted in torment. The ephemeral light of recognition in her eyes winked out, replaced by the grim emptiness he feared most. Jon roared in frustration, hacking through another white to reach her. But the Night King raised his free hand. A wave of cold smashed into Jon, as if the storm itself had formed a battering ram. He flew back, colliding with the rubble so hard that the impact drove the air from his lungs. Spots danced before his eyes. By the time he blinked them away, the Night King and Daenerys were moving away, swallowed by the swirling mass of undead. A half-dozen whites rushed in, forming a wall of rotting flesh and snapping jaws to bar Jon's pursuit. He fought with all the fury of heartbreak, cleaving limbs and skulls, kicking corpses aside. But they were too many, and he was alone. He barely parried a rusty sword aimed at his throat. Another white grabbed his leg, teeth gnashing. He carved through it, but the distraction allowed a third to slash his upper arm. Pain flared hot, blood soaking his cloak. Still, he swung, unstoppable, roaring in helpless rage. Every step he took, the Night King and Daenerys receded further into the winter gloom, heading toward the fortress. Finally, Grey Worm's voice rang out, distant but fierce. A contingent of Unsullied broke through the swirling chaos, spears leveled, forming a phalanx around Jon Dowdale. They skewered the nearest whites, dragging them back from him. Tormund followed, swinging a massive warhammer, caving in the skulls of the dead. Jon, gasping for breath, forced himself upright, ignoring the throb in his shoulder. His eyes darted around for any sign of Daenerys, but the swirl of snow was thick, and the movement of undead was chaotic. "They're pushing harder toward the gate," Tormund bellowed, pointing with his hammer. "We have to fall back or they'll cut us off." Jon hesitated, torn between the urge to chase Daenerys and the knowledge that doing so meant certain death for him and for anyone who followed. Already, he could see an unbroken wall of whites pressing in from all sides, frost-laden arms reaching hungrily. If they didn't retreat now, they'd be encircled. Cursing under his breath, he jerked his head toward Winterfell's walls. "Fall back," he roared, voice cracking with sorrow. "Back to the keep." The Unsullied nodded, forming a defensive ring as they started to withdraw. Tormund took the rear with Jon, pounding away at any white that lunged too close. The biting wind whipped at them, and the green glow of wildfire had begun to fade. The living had done their best to sow chaos, but it wasn't enough. Each step back felt like an admission of failure. Another chance to free Daenerys slipped through his fingers. By the time they reached the battered gates of Winterfell, whites were already piling up at the moat outside, shrieking and clambering over each other to breach the defenses. Archers on the walls fired frantically, picking them off in droves, but more replaced them from behind. The echoes of horns blared again, ordering the living to hold strong. Jon, panting, stumbled inside, the gate slamming shut behind the last of the retreating soldiers. They hastily barred it with splintered beams and hammered in iron spikes, but the entire structure groaned under the pressure. One giant push, and it might collapse. Within the courtyard, chaos reigned. Wounded were dragged to the side, laid on top of old blood-stained blankets. Davos scurried among them, barking for the maesters. Sansa stood on a small platform, resolutely shouting directions to archers along the ramparts. Everywhere, men and women bore savage wounds, eyes wild with terror. The roars of the dragons overhead shook the very stones. Jon caught a glimpse of Rhaegal unleashing a torrent of flame on a cluster of white scaling the northern wall. Smoke and ash billowed, but Daenerys' presence near the gate threatened to quench that flame at any moment. Jon clenched his teeth. She was within reach. He had nearly broken her free, only to see her slip away again. How many more chances would they get before Winterfell itself succumbed to the dead? Grey Worm directed a contingent of Unsullied to brace the inside of the gate. Tormund helped them push beams into place. Tyrion ran up, breath ragged, eyes bulging in alarm at the fresh blood running down Jon's arm. "You are hurt," he said, half in horror, half in concern. "I'll manage," Jon growled, though the pain made him dizzy. "Daenerys is out there, near the gate. She was so close to breaking free, Tyrion." But the Night King, he trailed off, shaking his head in frustration, tears threatening to sting his eyes. Tyrion squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. "Gods be good, we can't lose hope, or we lose everything. The men won't hold that gate for long, though. We need to pull back to the inner courtyard if it collapses." Jon started to object, but a fresh, thunderous impact rocked the gate. The wood splintered, sending shards flying. Screams erupted, and men scrambled back. Grey Worm shouted an order, and spears thrust outward through the gaps, trying to keep the horde at bay. Sansa's voice carried from above. "Fall back to the second line." A wave of defenders peeled away from the ramparts, heading inward, forming a new perimeter or a great hall and adjoining corridors. Another blow, and the gate caved inward with a groaning wail. Whites poured in like water, a churning mass of death. The defenders rushed to meet them in a savage melee. Steel clashed against rotted bone. Jon wiped blood from his brow, ignoring the lancing pain in his shoulder, and hurled himself at the nearest white, cleaving it in two. Every step, every strike was a struggle. The undead pressed relentlessly, snapping jaws and gnarled fingers grabbing for flesh. The courtyard degenerated into a swirling chaos of frantic battle cries. Somewhere in the torrent, Jon heard Grey Worm's stern commands, Tormund's booming curses, Davos' desperate plea. Tyrion clung to the sidelines, stabbing at any white that got too close. face pale with terror. Sansa, from atop the stone steps, fired arrows with surprising speed, each shot trembling with the force of her determination. The taste of panic and iron filled the air. A savage roar erupted overhead, Drogon swooping down, unleashing a torrent of flame that carved a blackened swath through the whites in the courtyard. Jon shielded his face from the heat, a torrent that momentarily gave the defenders breathing room. But even as the flames receded, a blast of cold whipped across the yard, extinguishing the lingering fire. Through the haze of smoke, Daenerys emerged at the threshold, eyes aflame with that eerie blue glow, the Night King towering behind her. The defenders recoiled in horror. Bodies, both living and dead, strewn across the ground. Jon felt his heart twist. She stood there, regal and terrible, the frost swirling around her like a cloak. This was the moment, he realized. The final confrontation. They had nowhere else to retreat, no other illusions to hide behind. If she advanced, if the Night King commanded all his forces in a single ruthless push, Winterfell would fall within minutes. Gritting his teeth, Jon hobbled forward, ignoring the protests of those around him. He lifted Longclaw, though he wasn't sure how he could possibly face them both. Blood trickled down his arm, each pulse reminding him he was flesh and bone in a realm now claimed by ice. Yet he refused to yield. "Daenerys!" he shouted again, voice cracking with desperation. She gazed at him, expression unreadable. The Night King remained eerily still, as though savoring the moment. Whites milled at the periphery, a silent ocean awaiting the next command. For an instant, no one moved. The battered defenders of Winterfell formed a broken ring around Jon, archers fumbling for fresh arrows, Unsullied struggling to stay upright, Tormund and Grey Worm panting from the day's brutal fighting. Drogon circled overhead, uncertain, while Rhaegal soared beyond in the smoky sky. Tyrion and Sansa hovered behind the line, hearts pounding, eyes trained on Jon as though praying for a miracle. Jon met Daenerys' frozen gaze, seeing the faint ghost of the woman he loved shimmering behind that wall of ice. He forced a step closer, sword lowered. The swirling cold around her flared in warning, yet he did not stop. The hush of the courtyard deepened, a breathless anticipation that seemed to stall time. If ever there was a moment for her to remember, truly remember, this was it. She had once commanded armies, freed slaves, stood against tyrants. She was Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, who had always claimed her destiny with both hands. Could she not claim it once more, and cast off the chains of winter? Silence stretched, every eye fixed on the pale queen. Then her lips moved, shaping a single syllable. Jon. A tremor rippled through the frost-laden air, as though the power binding her was momentarily uncertain. At her side, the Night King's glacial eyes narrowed. He lifted one hand, as if to reassert control. The defenders tensed. Jon's heart thundered. Now. It had to be now, or never.